All right, guys, so what we want to do now is we want to implement local storage for our settings, okay? Because right now, if we change a setting and we reload, it just goes back to the default. So we're going to go to our store.js file, okay, which is like the top of our Redux store or state or just whole implementation. So from here, notice that we have this initial state, which is just set to empty by default, and then this gets passed in to the our store, this create store with Firebase. So what I want to do is I want to actually add some settings to this state that come from local storage. Okay, so in local storage, we want to check to see if there's anything there for settings. If it's null, then we want to set some default values, the true false values, and put that in there. So what I'll do is go right above where we create the initial state, and let's say check for settings in local storage. So I'm going to put an if statement here, and I'm going to say if local storage dot get item settings, okay, is equal to null. All right, so if it's equal to null, that means there's nothing in there. So I want to set some defaults. So it's default settings. Okay, and I'm going to do that by creating a default settings variable with an object, and I'm going to copy what I have in the reducer, which is where the hell is it? Reducer, settings reducer. So this right here, let's grab these three and let's put that in store.js in the default settings. Now what do we want for default? Allow registration, I'll keep on false. We'll just keep it as is. And then we need to actually set it back to local storage, or I'm sorry, set it initially to local storage. So we do that by, let's put a comment here, we'll say set to local storage. So local storage dot set item. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with local storage, but you can only put strings in local storage. So we want to set the key as settings, and then if I do default settings, we can't really do this. It's not going to hold a JavaScript object literal inside a local storage. So what we want to do is we want to turn this into a JSON string before we store it. So I'm going to wrap this right here in a function called JSON.stringify, okay, which will basically just turn it into a JSON string before it gets put in. So that means that when we pull it out, we need to parse it back into an object, which we'll do. But for now, that gets put in there, and then in our initial state, we want to set settings to, actually we don't want quotes here. We don't want quotes. We want to set settings to whatever is in local storage settings. So instead of just doing local storage dot get item settings, we can't just do that because that's actually a string. We want this to be an object like this. So we're going to wrap this in JSON.parse, okay, which will parse it back to an object. So let me just reiterate what's going on. We're going to check local storage for a value of settings, a key of settings. If it's not there, we're going to set this object default settings, and then we're going to stringify it and store it in local storage. And then the initial state, when that's checked, when the application loads, settings is going to be filled with whatever is put in settings, okay, inside local storage. It's going to be parsed into an object and put into that piece of state. So let's go ahead and save this, and now we need to go back to our reducer because the defaults are no longer going to be in our reducer. So we can get rid of these. We can also get rid of this state equals initial state. We can just say state equals an empty object because we're not actually filling anything at this point. it's already getting filled in store.js. And then down here, instead of just saying disable balance on add, instead of just toggling it here, we're going to set this to action.payload, because we're going to send a payload from the action now. So action.payload and action.payload. Okay, so that's our reducer. Now let's go to our actions file. So settings, actions. And what we've done so far is we've just basically sent along the action type, and that's it. And then we just toggled it inside the reducer. Well, now we need to deal with local storage. We need to get the actual value. For instance, if this is set to true in our local storage and we check the box and we set off this action, we need to toggle it and then send that to the reducer as a payload. All right, so let's start with this set disabled on add. So we want to, first of all, get settings from local storage. So we'll create a variable called settings, and we'll set that to json.parse, because remember it's stored as a string, and local storage.getItem. The key is settings. So we'll get that out. Then we're going to toggle it here instead of in the reducer. So we'll say settings dot disable balance on add is going to be equal to not settings dot disable balance on add. It's just going to toggle it from true or to false, whatever. And then we need to set it back to local storage. Okay, so to do that, we're going to say local storage dot set item as settings, and we want to put it back into a string, so json.stringify, and then pass in settings. Okay, and then we want to send along the payload to the reducer. So the payload is going to be settings dot disable balance on add. Okay, so basically we're getting the initial object from local storage. We're going to toggle this particular value, disable balance on add, and then we're going to, actually I'm sorry, this shouldn't be set. This should be just disabled on add, like that. And then this should also be set is the name of the function. Okay, so it's going to toggle the value, it's going to put it back into local storage, and then just send the payload over, whether it's true or false, to the reducer. Okay, and we're basically going to do the same thing for all of these, so we can just copy everything in here. Actually, let's not copy, let's not copy the return, just this. And then we'll go right here, we'll go right above the return, and we want to just change this to on edit. Edit. I'm going to set it back into settings, and then we'll send along the payload, which will be settings dot disable balance on edit. All right, we'll do the same thing for allow registration. Settings dot allow registration. Okay, and then let's see, send along the payload, which will be settings dot allow registration. All right, so I think we should be all set. We're setting it in local storage initially, and then our actions are going to update it in local storage and send it to the reducer as a payload. And then our form, our settings form, should react to that. So let's go ahead and reload this, and let's set allow registration. Okay, now it was set to true here, and if I reload, it stays checked. it stays as true. If I look at the state here, we look at settings, it's set to true. If I look in my application here, if we go to the Chrome Tools application and we go to local storage and go to the host, you'll see right here, this is the stuff that's being stored in local storage, and allow registration is set to true. If I check that, it sets to false. If I check that, that gets set to true, and that's going to be true throughout our entire application. So we can now use these settings to do certain things. So that's what we're going to do next. Is we're going to make it so that the add form, for example, if we have this checked and we go to add a user, a client, this will be disabled. Okay, so we want to do that in the next video.